leukocyte disorders. In the last lecture, we talked about erythrocyte disorders. Leukocytes are white blood cells, and one of the main leukocyte disorders is called leukemia. And leukemia is basically cancer conditions involving white blood cells. There's lots of different leukemias out there, but when we talk about just these two basic types, acute leukemia involves blast-type cells. And blast-type cells are those baby cells that I always talk about, kind of the developmental cells. So this type primarily affects children, and then chronic leukemia is more prevalent in older people. So leukemia, basically, immature white blood cells are found in the bloodstream in all leukemias. So what happens is, remember that bone marrow is making all of our formed elements in our cells, including white blood cells. And so what's happening in the bone marrow is the bone marrow starts to make these cancerous leukocytes, because cancer takes kind of over a cell's ability to control its own growth, and it continues to undergo mitosis and produce many more cells. And the white blood cells that they produce are not functional. And so what's going to happen most of the time, death will be caused by internal hemorrhaging, and then overwhelming infections. So basically your immune system isn't working properly because your white blood cells aren't working properly. So what they can do now, nowadays, is do bone marrow transplants, very, very common for leukemia, some irradiation, and anti-leukemic drugs. And those are the main treatments that they're going to use to treat different types of leukemia. Now, the only thing we haven't talked about are the platelets. This is the third formed element that is found in your bloodstream. And platelets are caused or are created from a cell called a megakaryocyte. And basically what a megakaryocyte does is it fragments. And when it fragments and little pieces are lost, they become platelets. And platelets are going to help us clot our blood. So what it does when you break a blood vessel is, because these platelets are fragments, they're kind of jagged. And what they do is they catch on to a blood vessel, a broken blood vessel wall, and they cause something called a platelet plug. And that's going to be the original way that we stop our bleeding. So the creation or genesis of platelets, they come from a stem cell called a hemocytoblast. All of your formed elements, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, all come from the same stem cell. And what's going to happen for just the platelet part of it is you start with the hemocytoblast, then it's going to differentiate into a megakaryoblast, and finally into a megakaryocyte, and then it's going to fragment off and form your platelets. So this leads us to how we actually stop bleeding. We have an entire chemical reaction in our body that helps us clot our blood when we break a blood vessel. This process is called hemostasis. And so during hemostasis, the very first thing that's going to happen is called a vascular spasm. Then a platelet plug will be formed, and then we're going to actually create some clotting proteins to clot the blood. So when we have a vascular spasm, what it's going to do is the broken blood vessel is going to dilate and constrict, and basically try to cut off the blood flow to that blood vessel. And then, sorry, I went to the next slide. And then, so it's gonna dilate and then constrict real hard so that it can stop the bleeding. Then, coagulation. And so basically during coagulation, this is when we're going to clot the blood. And coagulation is a series of chemical reactions that are going to transform the blood from that liquid state that it's normally in to kind of a gel-like state. And this is the final 3 steps. There's more to it than this, but this is all I'm going to ask you guys to remember, is that we have something called prothrombin, and that is going to be formed. It's a plasma protein that is converted into thrombin, which is an enzyme, and enzymes catalyze reactions. So then thrombin is going to catalyze the joining of something called fibrinogen. And fibrinogen, they're basically just, it's a protein, fibrous protein, and it's going to turn it into a fibrin mesh. It's going to turn into kind of a net. And when it turns into this net, any of the blood cells that are flowing by are going to get caught. And when they get caught up in the net, they form the actual clot. Now, unfortunately, with everything, there can be disorders. So hemostasis disorders are disorders of clotting the blood. And so what can happen when the blood actually clots up, it doesn't go away. So in a healthy person, in a healthy blood vessel, the clot eventually, once the blood vessel is able to regenerate, then that clot is going to be broken back down. If it stays in the unbroken blood vessels, so the blood vessel's totally healed, then it is called a thrombus, and it's basically caught on the vessel wall. And so what can happen is it can block some circulation, and if it's in the heart, it can cause a heart attack. And that's what a coronary thrombosis is. And then if the thrombus releases from the wall, then it becomes an embolus. So an embolus is a free-floating thrombus, and that can then go anywhere in the body. And if it goes into the lungs, it could be a pulmonary emboli that could impair the body's ability to obtain oxygen. And then if it goes into the brain, it becomes a cerebral emboli, and that's what can cause a stroke. Now, there are also bleeding disorders where, and you guys have probably heard of hemophilia, and that is just, it's a hereditary bleeding disorder that does not allow you to clot your own blood. So basically, you don't code for the proteins that are there to clot the blood, the prothrombin, the thrombin, et cetera, et cetera. And what's going to happen is you're going to have blood transfusions to inject you with those missing protein factors that are going to clot the blood.